Good evening, everybody. We'll just give it another minute or so before we make a start, and so it won't be too long, and we'll kick off formally. So we'll just give another minute or two for people to join from their various clinical commitments. So do stay there, and we'll get started imminently. Okay, I think we'll kick off. So it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody this evening to our next Consultant Forum meeting, which is being recorded for those who aren't able to join at this stage. For those who are joining the meeting, I'd be grateful if you could keep yourselves on mute in the usual way so that we can get as little feedback as possible. And then we'll take some questions at the end of the session once our speaker has had a chance to talk to us initially. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Tom Keith-Roach this evening. I'm just going to read a little bit out about Tom so I don't forget anything by way of introduction. But Tom Keith-Roach is the CEO of AstraZeneca UK. He led AstraZeneca UK through the COVID pandemic, having taken the role of CEO at the start of 2020. He's an expert in respiratory drug development and passionate about transforming outcomes in chronic diseases, addressing healthcare inequality and in the future of UK life sciences. Before heading up the UK company, Tom's roles in AstraZeneca included leading the respiratory and immunology division globally, leading the ticagrelor franchise globally, and national and regional leadership roles in Europe, Korea, China. And prior to that, he spent time in consulting, venture capital, and the British Army. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Tom as AstraZeneca UK CEO to Cambridge University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust and our biomedical campus partners. One thing Tom has asked me to just be clear about, and I'd be very grateful if we could all just be mindful of this, is that we stick with the standard Chatham House rules this evening. Not that we're expecting anything to be particularly contentious or political, but it would be great that anything that is talked about confidentially here doesn't make its way into, for example, the press. That would be most helpful. And Tom, I hope that covers that for you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to hand over to Tom to kick off for us. He's got a few slides. I'm going to talk to us for some time, and then subsequently there'll be a chance for us to do some Q&A, and all be done and dusted by 7 o'clock at the latest. So Tom, you're very welcome, and over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Justin, and thanks for that lovely introduction. Impeccable timing, wasn't it, to come back to take on this role? 24 days, I think it was, before we went into the first lockdown. But it's been a really extraordinary 18 months at AstraZeneca over the last year or two. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join you this evening. I think it's a really important moment for UK healthcare and life sciences coming out of the pandemic. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that. And I don't know, Justin, the degree to which you've had anyone from AZ talk about our presence in Cambridge and what we're trying to do on the CBC. But if that's also interesting, I could cover that.
Yes, please. That would be very interesting. Thank you.
Great. So I think, Justin, you said I might talk a little bit about vaccines. I don't want to get too bogged down in this. But before I tell the AZ story of the last 18 months, it's probably important just to know that AstraZeneca is not a vaccines company. Actually, up till the beginning of last year, we have one intranasal influenza vaccine, which is used in the schools program here. But actually, the company's focused on oncology, cardiovascular disease, respiratory and immunology. But about April of last year, we were invited in to the Oxford program by the government. And actually looking back on it, probably at that point, AstraZeneca was pretty much the only company in the UK with the right footprint and the right capabilities who could have stepped in. At that stage, the UK government wanted first dibs, if you like, on 100 million early doses for the UK, which really ruled out European and US pharmaceutical companies. And GSK actually were already in a joint venture on vaccines with Sanofi. And Oxford already by that point wanted a partner that was willing to develop and manufacture and supply the vaccine globally at no cost. So really, they needed a company that was aligned with that mission and also had the potential to take the vaccine globally. And so, we decided at that point to step into that space in partnership with the UK government and with Oxford. And it's been, I guess, a bit of a whirlwind over the last 18 months with all of its ups and downs, but we're definitely very proud so far that we've supplied 1.4 billion doses globally to more than 70 countries around the world, which is a lot of vaccine, and obviously with a lot of learnings, I guess, for us as a company that's new to that space. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that. I think probably across the company, we hope that beyond the pandemic itself, the lasting impact of that story will be that the government, that policymakers, the media, the public now really understand the full importance of having a strong life sciences industry located here onshore in the UK. And I think if you step back and look at the sort of global politics of it, probably, and I should probably set aside China and Russia in saying this, that the UK and the US probably are today the only countries in the world that have the types of capabilities that you need, from basic science through global clinical development and regulatory, vaccines, product manufacturing, fill and finish, and global distribution, that was required to bring forward a domestically produced and developed vaccine on that kind of timescale. And although it's called the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the team at Oxford, the Jenner, Oxford Biomedica, Cobra in North Wales, SGS in Scotland, certainly the MHRA and the JCVI, the JAKS Vaccines Task Force, and the NHS, who've been just unbelievable, outstanding, and thanks to everybody on this call for everything that you've done, not just in vaccine delivery, but actually we've got one of the most robust pharmacovigilance systems in the world in the UK, and the NHS was able to understand efficacy, safety, conduct pretty extensive genomic screening of samples of new patients that were turning up at hospital, to identify new variants and provide researchers like us with the data that we needed to continuing to tweak the vaccine for dominant variants. Really no other country on earth apart from us and the US have the capability to do that. And I hope that what it means is, coming out of the pandemic, that life sciences and healthcare get the funding and the support that they need to continue to do that for the long term. I don't know whether we can move the slides.
I'm sure we can, Tony, if you don't mind.
Yeah, if you could jump on maybe 2. Yeah, to this one. Beyond, I would say, our experience of the last 18 months, certainly the things that we're pushing in the broader healthcare environment right now in the UK. On the left-hand side, it's pretty clear that the NHS has been running too hot for too long, even before the crisis, in terms of beds and staff and funding and capacity for clinical research. 70% of secondary and tertiary hospital beds in the UK, even before the crisis, were clogged up with patients suffering from chronic conditions. And health inequality, we know all about, is certainly very confronting. So there has to be a better way of delivering care and healthcare resilience for the longer term. We've seen a huge acceleration of data and digital, which has got to continue. The UK, certainly to the industry, has long promised health data integration, but actually as an investor in research, Scotland does better, Estonia, Sweden, Iceland, they're miles ahead of where we are across NHS England right now. And so I think it really is an issue for research, but also for ability to deliver integrated care, meet quality standards, prioritize and risk stratify patients on risk. So that's something that we're pushing heavily with the government. And also, on the right-hand side, this is a picture actually of vaccines being loaded onto a plane as part of our commitment to COVAX. Certainly the view within the company globally is that the UK is a country which can be at its best when we set our differences aside and combine our strengths across academia, private industry and government. We're pretty much fantastic in a crisis. The question is how we start to make that business as usual as we come out of the pandemic. So I think, with everything that's gone on over the last 18 months, and certainly the political environment around healthcare, there's going to be a really interesting moment of opportunity to create excellence in life sciences and healthcare if we can manage the environment in the right way together over the next 12 and 24 months.
I mean, it's actually, from a personal perspective, quite nice to hear some optimism and positivity, because it's at the back end of a pretty long, almost 2 years, with the pressures and constraints that you talk to, and I see at the left of your slide there, and the NHS pushed to its limits. That's certainly how it feels, I think, for many people on the call. But as you also say, perhaps out of most crises, often good things do happen. Hence you being in Cambridge, I guess. You as in the company.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the next slide, there are a few things I would be watching pretty closely, Justin. Certainly we're keeping our eye on these, because I think whilst we view it as a moment of opportunity for UK life sciences, that has to be taken in the context where the healthcare system has to catch up and level up really before it can start thinking about how it's going to leap ahead. We've had a new life sciences vision for the UK that Boris Johnson published about a month ago, which is certainly a positive thing and has some themes about funding. But when we look back since 2015, there have been, I think, 7 UK life sciences visions published by government, 4,816 pages, which is an incredible statistic. Lots of good words, but as good as they are, so far as we look at UK life sciences before we talk about healthcare, certainly the relative international attractiveness for life sciences investment has continued to erode. UK share of patients recruited into global studies is down from 3rd to 7th. UK exports of pharmaceuticals is down from 40 to 30 billion. Per capita uptake of new medicines in the UK is still way below median benchmarks across comparator countries and continues to slip. So, the policy is great. Clearly there is opportunity, but our voice in government at this point is that we've got enough words and rhetoric, and the policy agenda needs to move now towards more money and more action across the whole piece. I think the government spending review, which is due on the 27th of October alongside the budget, is going to tell us a lot about the ability of government to really get behind that vision. And certainly because of our interest in UK science and particularly research, we're pushing hard in that spending review for more money for clinical research, more human resources and research infrastructure to go into the NHS. One of the reasons we located in Cambridge is to partner with the NHS and other institutions to do research. But we can't do that if the government's not willing to fund the health system side of that bargain. We're pushing for new money for data integration for the reasons that I outlined, and also for the full funding of the MHRA. They've been absolutely brilliant over the course of the last 24 months. And I think having a marquee kite mark regulator is probably one of the few big obvious opportunities to come out of Brexit. But it's not going to work if we cut the funding resources that are there to support the MHRA by 60%. Then I'm afraid that all new technologies that come into the healthcare system in the UK are going to end up being reviewed by Europe first, and then rubber stamped by the UK later, which will actually mean that we're not independent when it comes to healthcare technology, and we're receiving drugs and other technologies later than our partners in Europe. And so, data integration, clinical research, independent regulatory funding are the 3 areas where we think that the government really needs to put its money where its mouth is to invest in the future of UK life sciences. And of course, on the right-hand side, the NHS bill that's currently in Parliament is a matter of a huge amount of debate. Certainly I'm probably speaking to experts here, but we see that as broadly positive if it can be delivered. Who doesn't want to get behind the principles of competition being replaced by collaboration, and integrated data pathways and budgets across primary and secondary and tertiary care? But at the same time, the NHS is Byzantine, right? Better than I do. Actually, it's an amalgamation of more than 20,000 different organizations across the country. So how you actually deliver that transformation without losing 5 or even 10 years in some kind of confused transition, I think probably becomes the exam question, and how you deliver that alongside pandemic recovery and clearing waiting lists. And so I think at all levels, certainly in our industry and in the NHS, that's going to require a lot of really inspired leadership and focus on what matters is probably in what's going to probably be quite an confusing environment over the next 20 months, to make sure we've got our eye on the ball and that we're able to succeed and win for patients.
That's interesting, I think, because perhaps thinking about the NHS as one massive entity is part of where the problems arise in terms of it's too big to solve, possibly, and where the focus on integrated care systems moving forward, where geographically more co-located primary, secondary, and potentially tertiary care systems work together across communities, maybe using those as a way of making small gains across the country might be the way forward, but perhaps more of that in the discussion later, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in very broad terms, we've got to be really smart about what needs to be integrated and local and what can be done once and doesn't have to be repeated. I led our global respiratory franchise for 7 years before doing this job. And there's a degree of complexity in respiratory medicine, but the data that's available around the world to support evidence-based guidelines is actually common. And because of the way that national guidelines now work through NICE, we tend to get national guidelines clinically that are updated once every 7 or 8 years. At the moment, a new consultation document's gone out from NICE BTS Sign on new national respiratory guidelines, which isn't going to read out till the second half of 2023. Whereas US guidelines and European guidelines are current and updated every year. And after that, you've got 92 area prescribing committees, you've got regional health economies, all of which have their own protocol, formulary, and guideline committees. And so in some areas, we find that it takes, 8-9 years for new evidence in the UK to make its way into national guidelines, and for those national guidelines to then cascade through to make sure that the care that patients receive on the front line is actually consistent with the most recent evidence. And it's actually a big contributor to healthcare inequality. Because NICE moves so slowly, what you find is that the more progressive local health economies are updating evidence-based guidelines far ahead of NICE, but those that are more cost-constrained, particularly in more deprived areas of the country, get evidence-based medicine and technology, 6 to 10 years after people in more affluent areas. And so I think the move toward integrated care systems and integrating care locally is a really good thing. But alongside that, there are clearly some areas where, if we just were able to do it once and do it well and do it fast, I think it would probably improve standards of care and contribute to eliminating healthcare inequality. I don't think we're always getting that balance right.
That's certainly something that locally and regionally we're working through at the moment, as is the rest of the UK, I guess. Thank you for your thoughts on that, Tom. I think you said you were going to tell us a little bit about your sort of wider research sort of plans and sure. Cambridge in particular.
Yeah, great. Sorry, we said it wasn't going to be political, and I talked about the political environment. So yeah, if you go to the next slide, I mean, maybe just a bit of an introduction to AZ. I don't know whether everybody really knew who AZ was before 18 months ago, but I looked at our stock price this morning. AstraZeneca is actually the largest publicly traded company in the UK. We're FTSE 1. And so we're the UK's leading company, and certainly biosciences company. And the UK's leading investor, at least in the private sector in R&D, as you can see on this slide. We've actually been headquartered in the UK for a very long time. The company was created in 2000 between a merger between English Zeneca, which came out of ICI Chemicals originally. The British half of the company used to be ICI, and Astra, which is a Swedish company with heavy R&D and manufacturing investments in Södertälje and Mölndal in Sweden. So we're kind of an Anglo-Swedish company by background, but headquartered in the UK. Before about 6 years ago, we were headquartered. Our R&D and manufacturing headquarters were in the north, in Macclesfield, and our corporate headquarters were down in Paddington, in West London. But when Pascal joined the company and tripled our investment in R&D, he moved our global headquarters, as you probably know, to Cambridge. So right now, our manufacturing operations are still up in Macclesfield. We produce vaccines in Merseyside. Our R&D headquarters is here in Cambridge on the biomedical campus. We've got about 3,000 people right now in different science parks around Cambridge, but the majority of them will now consolidate into the CBC site now that that's open. And by the end of next year, we'll have about 1,100 scientists operating in the CBC in Cambridge. I think probably if you've been in a Panther taxi at any point in Cambridge over the last 24 months, you'll know about the basement swimming pool that we had and some of the construction challenges that we faced over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. But the main site on the CBC on the next slide is actually now open. And as I said, all the lab space is going to start to open up from the end of this year. And we really think there's something special about the Cambridge, Oxford, London biosciences cluster. If you put those three things together, it's actually the third largest biosciences cluster in the world, and an unbelievable place therefore for us to be located and to do science. And the site on the CBC has been designed with collaboration with colleagues from other institutions, from Addenbrooke's, from the Royal Papworth in mind. And actually in this photo, if you look at the right-hand side, you can see that the site is actually open to the public. That path you can see coming up from, I guess that's southwest into the center of the building, actually opens up into the central atrium of the new site. And in there, what you're going to find if you come and join us at any point is a 5,000 square foot lunch and coffee shop and cafe that's open to anybody who works on the CBC. So the whole idea when we located here was to design the space for collaboration so that partners could come in, use the space, start to work with our scientists, and obviously it includes conference and other facilities there as well. And so we have a huge number of existing collaborations with institutions across CBC, but we really expect that to accelerate next year. And then again, when the new government-funded cancer hospital is built. And the idea here is to massively accelerate the translational programs that we have from bench to bedside, with researchers co-located with clinicians across our 3 therapy areas.
That sounds very exciting, Tom. And I'm sure that a lot of the academics who are, as well as the NHS clinicians who are listening in at the moment, will look forward to that very much. Did you say it's sort of open now on a small scale?
Yeah, we've opened the public areas on the ground floor. The lab spaces are still under construction, and so they're going to start opening from the first quarter of next year.
Fantastic. And will you have, and this might come out, I guess, in some of the questions later, but yeah, will you have, or are you already opening lines of sort of communication with particular research groups on the biomedical campus, or is that something that you remain open to as things develop over time?
Yeah, we've been, I think so far, very active in basic research. We're partnered with the MRC. We've established a functional genomics centre with CRUK and the Antibody Alliance Labs. I think if I go to the next two slides, I mean, maybe I'll give you a bit of a sense, Justin, about, you know, where we want to take those partnerships as the site matures. And I'll talk a little bit about research partnerships, and then I'll talk also a little bit about healthcare service redesign and delivery, which really are the two areas where we want to work with all of you. Firstly, and I touched on this at the start, our scientists in AstraZeneca, and we'll put vaccines aside for the moment, are focused in three therapy areas. And the disease biology, understanding the disease biology and investing in the science platforms and drug delivery modalities that underpin them. In cancer, we're driven by the mission to try and eliminate cancer as a leading cause of death by trying to hit cancer earlier, hit it harder, and hit it smarter. And so we're investing heavily in early detection, in cell therapy, in immunotherapy, ADCs, and we're investing across multiple platforms and approaches, matching the heterogeneity of cancer. I think respiratory is the second, probably I would say biologically is still in the dark ages. You know, to be fair, I think we've made some progress in asthma, in phenotyping particularly severe asthma patients and developing precision medicine. But actually, the vast majority of asthma patients, we don't really understand the underlying mechanisms of their disease, and quality standards in clinical practice are pretty poor. And that's before you go on and talk about a disease like COPD, where honestly, we and the community don't yet really understand the underlying biology of that disease. Historically, drug development in COPD has meant find something that works in asthma. And run a phase 3 program in COPD and see if it works, which really isn't an investment model for the industry anymore. You know, perhaps there's a small group of eosinophilic COPD patients, but we're really shooting in the dark. And so we're doing a lot of work to try and develop better understanding of underlying disease biology across respiratory diseases. And developing precision targets and therapeutics to address them. Immunology is a very attractive area for drug development right now. We've got a much better understanding of underlying disease mechanisms. And also because therapeutic interventions have moved beyond signs and symptoms, exacerbations, breath function in respiratory, and starting to be able to show interventions which can change the course of disease and slow disease progression. Immunology is an attractive place also from a payer perspective, because governments are willing to pay for those endpoints. So we're investing more and more now within our respiratory and immunology franchise in immunological conditions. Cardiorenal, similarly, diabetes, renal, CVD, probably the single largest areas of disease burden in society, despite recent advances. So we're investing heavily there too. Probably we can spend some more time during Q&A, but certainly across all three of those, we're very keen to collaborate. And then on the next slide, you know, the other territory I think you will find the biopharmaceutical industry increasingly investing in is to partner with the healthcare system to invest in new care models that have the potential to unblock patient pathways, improve patient outcomes at the population level, and reduce systems costs, which is very aligned with the overall direction of travel within the integrated care systems. And so I think you'd find, certainly for AstraZeneca, but probably most of the other large pharmaceutical companies now, there's been a really marked move in the last 5 years away from just selling products and toward partnering with the NHS to start to solve some of those problems. Now, obviously, we're a commercial business, as our competitors are, so we're not totally commercially uninterested, but we tend to invest in disease areas and improving pathways where we have guideline recommended medicines. And I mean, maybe to illustrate a couple of examples, maybe I'll use two. The first would be a heart failure partnership we formed with Greater Glasgow and Clyde up in Scotland, which is actually just gone pan Scotland, where 6 months ago with the heart failure team in Glasgow, we were looking at a waiting list of 3,000 suspected heart failure patients who are awaiting diagnosis via echocardiogram, but with a waiting time of over 12 months. And so we deployed with Philips and US2AI handheld echocardiograms into the hands of practice nurses in the community with adaptive AI linked to specialized centers and a learning algorithm that has become highly effective based on those handheld echoes, identifying patients with left ventricular failure, who could then be fast-tracked triages for echo at secondary care centers. And so far, waiting times have come down from 12 months to 6 months. And at the same time, the number of echocardiograms and consultant clinic appointments in hospitals have come down by 50%. And so we're now taking that across Scotland and seeing whether we can have a similar impact on a broader geographic scale with that service commissioned until the end of 23. I won't bore you with more examples, but I think the point is increasingly, because of the needs of the healthcare system, companies like AstraZeneca are investing in those sorts of programs, obviously with a real world evidence wrapper. What we want to be able to do is prove that by intervening earlier and in a more efficient way, we can reduce healthcare systems costs and improve outcomes for patients at the population level. And so increasingly, my team is no longer made up of, if you like, salespeople. And increasingly, we're hiring data scientists, medics, pharmacists, people from medtech, people who've got experience in pathway redesign, so that we become a credible partner with the NHS in helping to sort of raise quality standards and improve care. So if you go to the next slide, certainly we have very active partnerships and an ambitious investment agenda in the areas down the left-hand side here, beyond basic research and clinical development. And I don't know whether you know the three people on the right-hand side. I lead our UK business, so I'm a pretty good first point of contact. But I probably also would say Susan Galbraith, who leads our oncology franchise from an R&D perspective, also lives and is based in Cambridge. She's a brilliant first point of contact for those of you who'd like to reach out and consider partnerships in oncology. And the same for Mene Pangalos. He's based in Cambridge too. He runs global R&D for respiratory and for cardiovascular renal metabolism. So that would be a sort of discussion starting point in terms of the areas that we're interested to partner and some of the people you might want to know.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Particularly, certainly for me as a jobbing clinician, the sort of transforming healthcare pathway side of things, as opposed to the pure laboratory-based research and drug development angle to the company is certainly potentially exciting and one that I'm sure others would be interested in. In terms of specifics, I'm going to ask everybody to have anybody who wants to ask Tom and as we open things up to a Q&A, just to raise your hand if you don't mind in the usual way on the screen, because I can't open everybody in my screen at the same time. And so I don't know if anyone has a particular question they want to ask Tom. We've got several academics and clinicians, as well as our BRC lead here on the call. In terms of people with interests in the areas that you've outlined, I mean, are you thinking that several times a year what you'll do as a company is put out calls to look for collaboration? Are you really relying on people sort of directly being more personable? And I'm not saying you're going to get 100 emails a day, but is that where the interactions in your building over coffee and lunch, is it that level of informality or formality? How do you see that working out over time?
I think probably you can afford to be extremely informal in reaching out to the people that you know from AstraZeneca. I mean, hopefully there won't be a tidal wave. Please feel free to reach out to me. But once we've got the CBC more formally open, I was talking to Mene and Susan before doing this and thinking about running a physical introduction to the site, an introduction to the research that our R&D teams are doing in more depth, get everybody over, get you guys introduced to the site, just to start to get the ball rolling in that direction. I'd be interested in your thoughts, Justin, in what we should be doing to start to make those connections.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get back to you with those. I'm gonna just open things up because we've got Professor Ken Smith and Professor Miles Parks who I know want to raise a question or a couple of comments. So we'll let Miles go first if that's okay, and then we'll ask Ken to comment. So Miles, thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Tom. Really interesting to hear your talk and your plans. I'm the director of the BRC here on the campus, and we wrestle with lots of things. One of those is data and the scale of the investment that we need to put into our data and IT infrastructure here. Why do you think the Scots have got this right, or how have they got this better than we've got it in England, at least at the moment? And what do you think we need to do? There's such a big gap between what should be possible and what we hear is possible, but actually on a ground level, what's possible. There's a massive gulf there.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, I'm no expert on data integration within the NHS. I think at least my interactions with NHS Scotland seem like they're one organisation. And I'm able to partner with NHS Scotland much more easily than it seems possible to partner with NHS England. NHS England, to me, seems to be essentially an administrative body sitting on top of, depending on how you want to define it, probably not 42. It probably feels more like 150 on the CCG side, and about 225 on the hospital trust side organisations. And I think the integrated care systems should be an opportunity to better integrate data systems, but I say that word with a great deal of caution.
Yeah, I mean, even dealing with things like NHS Digital, which sits under NHS England, but is its own fiefdom of rules and regulations and.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I hate to say it, but my experience at the moment in terms of accessing integrated NHS data, I'm getting far more traction working with a few third-party service providers that are actually not part of the NHS than I do partnering with NHS Digital. And I don't know whether those are dirty words, but companies like Eclipse right now, I think, sit on top of something like 35% of all primary care patient records. I can go there and start to think about triaging the recovery, identifying which patients are most at risk of an unplanned hospitalization for heart failure, pulling them in for a pharmacist review, far better than I can going to sit with parts of the NHS, apart from in places like Dorset, where they seem to have got their act together, and they seem to have achieved that in an integrated way across the care system, which doesn't seem to be true elsewhere. But I have to admit, I'm looking at that from the outside. The reasons why that's true, probably you're better qualified to speak to than I am.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. To start local and powerful and get one's own local house in order and then build outwards is the way. And Eclipse, as you say, is fantastic. Thank you very much for that, for those thoughts.
I mean, the challenge we have, and I suppose this is true everywhere, and I talked about the heart failure partnership. We've got others in asthma and in renal disease. Is in pockets of the NHS, we find it possible to integrate data, put new pathways in place, and actually generate pretty amazing evidence that you can improve quality standards at reduced cost if everybody's truly aligned behind the achievement of shared medical missions. The challenge we have, and I don't know how to address this, is even when we publish those results, it seems to be incredibly hard to get those innovations taken up by the NHS more broadly. Maybe ICS's help, it's 42, it's a smaller number. But as I said, my concern, I was talking to Justin about this on Sunday, is that the complexity of actually reorganization and integration is going to make that potentially even more difficult over the next 4 or 5 years. You know, we reorganize in business, but we tend to focus on reorganizations where the intervention that needs to be made to move from A to B is super clear. And the timeline involved in moving from A to B is also relatively short. You know, in general, those are the sorts of reorganizations that you prioritize, and in general, they're successful. How you move to 42 ICSs, you know, by the end of next year, it doesn't seem to meet those criteria as a business person looking from the outside in. And how you find effective ways to do that is going to be a challenge. But it would seem to me that data visibility across the pathway is almost a prerequisite. Until you've got that, it's going to be impossible to integrate pathways. And it's also going to be impossible to integrate budgets between primary and specialty care. You know, a lot of our primary care medicines have value only because they prevent patients from turning up in a hospital 6 months later, or all the associated costs. And so, you know, for us, in order for medicines to be budgeted and valued appropriately, we're sort of dependent on integrated data systems to be there in the first place. So if there are things that we can do in Cambridge on that agenda, which can provide leadership for other parts of the country, we'd be delighted to talk about it.
Great to hear. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ken Smith, Professor Ken Smith has a question for you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, I'm Ken Smith. I run the Department of Medicine here, a nephrologist and immunologist. And my question you sort of touched on aspects of, but I was wondering if you could perhaps rehearse for us whether you have any systematic strategies for interacting with the research on the campus. So you mentioned the sort of ad hoc approach of people who are interested in reaching out, but do you have plans that will allow a sort of more holistic meeting of minds so that things can bubble up spontaneously? Because I mean, I must admit, quite a few groups I don't think have had much contact, apart from in some cases with your recruiters who are very, very good, for example, who pinched the best 2 people out of my lab in the last year. So how do you approach that challenge?
I don't think we've been systematic enough, to be honest, Ken. And I probably can't speak to the detail of that for the R&D group as well as I should. But maybe that's something we should schedule as a follow-up meeting. And we should get together between you, me, Mene and Susan and try and put something a little bit more systematic in place.
I think that would be really interesting to do. We've had real success with it with other companies in the past, and I think we can learn a lot from those experiences and replicate them. So I think on balance, I think I shouldn't sound, hope I didn't sound negative before. I think we're all pretty excited. In fact, the other thing that we should all bear in mind is you're not actually fully here yet. And so there's a lot more to look forward to. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. I will ask another point from one of our neurologists, Tom. Just staying on what is potentially a slightly more negative angle, I guess, but here we go. As a neurologist specializing in Parkinson's disease, it's disappointing to see that pharma seems to be disinvesting in neurodegenerative disease, which is self-evidently so impactful to society as we age. Is this truly the case? And if so, why? And I think that should be fairly straightforward for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't say it's true of the entire industry. You know, companies like Biogen out of Boston and Lundbeck are heavily invested in neuroscience as a therapy area. But I think what I would say is across the industry, whereas probably 25 years ago, it was possible to specialize and compete in everything. Increasingly now, if you want to be competitive in oncology, you want to be competitive in immunology. The depth of the capabilities that are required to be globally competitive in those areas means, you know, you can't also try and do everything else. And so increasingly, the largest global biopharmaceutical companies are now specializing by therapy area. And, you know, it's one of the sort of existential conversations we're having now, having developed the vaccine for the UK, as to whether or not we now double down on that and add a 4th therapy area and start to become a vaccines company. on the one hand, that would seem logical after the progress we've made over the last 18 months. But as a company, we only have a fixed level of resourcing that we can invest in new science every year, depending on how well we sell those investments to our shareholders. And at the moment, the company's strategy is to continue to invest in the 3 therapy areas that I outlined. I guess the question behind the question, and this is true, is that in general, publicly traded pharmaceutical companies tend to invest in therapy areas, as I said, where we understand the underlying biology of the disease well enough, such that we can have a reasonable degree of confidence in identifying targets and developing therapeutics that can ultimately become medicines. And also, when we think about our payers, and they tend to be governments, in the UK, that's nice. They've got a pretty clear idea of which endpoints coming out of a phase 3 clinical study they're willing to value and which ones they're not. It sort of puts us in a framework where we also need to be developing medicines against endpoints that societies are willing to pay for. And in our case, that's led us to our 3 therapy areas. Companies like Lundbeck and Biogen, neuroscience, but I don't know the data. I probably would expect over the last 10 or 15 years that the amount of large pharma investment in neuroscience has gone down because it's an extremely challenging area for identifying new targets in drug development. And it's a pretty challenging payer environment as well. I apologize on behalf of the industry for all of that. But that probably just explains a little bit of the dynamic, certainly from AstraZeneca's perspective.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, whilst we wait to see if anyone else has any other questions, and we're coming up towards the end of our hour fairly soon. I mean, obviously we've had a bit of interaction about, lines of communication not necessarily having been as open, but I think it's fair to say one of the main reasons for actually having this evening was to really open up those lines of communication, because as you've said, the building isn't fully open. Your scientists aren't in there. So I guess one of the main reasons for this tonight was to let people know the vision that you as a company have and to start that ball rolling. Is that fair?
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, we sort of have opened it up for cosmetic purposes at the moment, but the lab's open, as I said, Q1 next year. And so I think this is really timely, and let's find a way as our lab staff start to come onto site to put in place a much more systematic introduction so we can build those connections wherever valuable. That'd be a lot of fun.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Professor Fiona Gilbert to ask a question now. Fiona, thank you.
Hi, I'm a radiologist, but I think it's, like everyone on this call, I think it's fantastic. It's such an amazing opportunity, that AZ is now here on our doorstep in Cambridge. And of course, one of the main reasons was because you wanted to be in the midst of, high-class scientists and graduates coming through the university. And it's an amazing symbiotic and potentially very symbiotic relationship. So are there things that we could do? As Ken was saying earlier, we've had, in our own department, we've had very successful relationships. I mean, we do already with AZ and with other companies in terms of studentships and, various kind of funding schemes like that, so that you get this double advantage of trading with, a commercial company, whether it be in pharma or, one of the other industries that we use in healthcare. Because for the individual, from a training perspective, it's the most amazing opportunity. It's a bit like our medical students going and doing GP placements. Okay, yeah, not in Cambridge, but in other places, 70% will end up as GPs. But for them, in terms of, we have the brightest students in Cambridge. I mean, they are exceptional. They are unbelievable, and not just the medics, but there must be ways whereby we can give them tasters, with your company, that they then bring ideas back. They've got direct line of sight to the ward. Yeah. There must be really innovative ways where we're doing many more placement opportunities, 8-week placement. We have SSCs where the students come and do, 4 or 5 weeks of this, in the wars or whatever, but to come and spend time with you guys. And I just think, there's just, it's the people going forward. You need the bright ideas and the scientists going forward. We need them in the science in order to continue the university being, a fabulous place to work. And so it's how we capitalize on. I think funding is a really important aspect to it. I think we need to persuade your shareholders that they should be investing very heavily in the University of Cambridge, because that's why you're there. That's why they've paid for you to move from Manchester. And so, we need to really use that leverage going forward. And whether it's with the joint stuff, case studentships are great, but we need a much bigger life science investment. And we need to persuade the government to really get behind the University of Cambridge AstraZeneca collaboration.
Thank you, Fiona. I wholeheartedly agree. And actually, a lot of that doesn't depend on government funding. We are recruiting people from the university. We absolutely can have all sorts of exchange programs with researchers and students from your hospitals coming in and working as part of our research teams at the biomedical campus. And probably we could find also opportunities for scientists from AstraZeneca to come and do preceptorship.
But we also, we need the money in order to continue to create that pipeline for you and for other pharma across the UK. So we need more funding for studentships and for postdocs so that we can continue to keep on building this going forward. It would be a very short-term game if it's just a one-way street into AstraZeneca, whereas if we can have this a much bigger base of expertise and science going forward. Anyway. Okay.
I think it's interesting how that last conversation has almost perhaps summed up what we hope, I think all of us here in our various different spheres professionally, will be the crux of the symbiotic relationship moving forward, and hence having this opening conversation this evening. I'm aware it's almost 7 o'clock. If anyone has anything burning they want to ask Tom, please put your hand up at this stage. Tom, I'd like to thank you very much, certainly on behalf of the Trust, and Ashley here as Medical Director, and Mike Moore, who's on as Chair, would, I'm sure, like to, through me, extend their thanks to you for giving up your time. Is there anything else, Tom, that you feel that we haven't covered, or any final messages you think you want us to know, or are you comfortable where we've got to?
No, I think the message is clear, Justin. We need to get a more structured framework for collaboration in place.
Perfect.
Really, really excited to get that feedback and also to get on with that with all of you through 2022.
Well, I think that excitement is mutual. And so, again, thank you on behalf of everybody here this evening. We really look forward to working with you and your team moving forward, and to some lunch in a new environment on the Cambridge Biomedical Campus in due course. So that's very exciting.
Good stuff.
Thank you very much. I think I don't see any more questions at this stage. So, Tom, thank you, much appreciated, and we will certainly be seeing you soon.
All the best.
Thanks a lot.